Today, Gary Lineker strikes a deal with the BBC to get back on air. Should we relax migration rules to fill job vacancies? And does the government spend too much on management consultants? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative peer and Times columnist Danny Finkelstein, Labour MP and Chair of the Business Select Committee Darren Jones, economist and author Mariana Mazzucato, and Deputy Editor of CapX Alice Denby. Today, Gary Lineker will return to our TV screens. The Match of the Day star comes to an agreement with the BBC. The corporation's boss says this.
We did take action which we thought was proportionate. And as the BBC, we believe we did the right thing. I think I did the right thing.
This Tory MP wanted Gary Lineker to apologise or face the sack. We'll get his response to today's deal. MPs will vote later on government plans to stop small boat crossings. Could some Tory MPs oppose it? Our guest today thinks governments spend too much on private sector consultants. Is she right? And Jeremy Hunt wants more of us to get back into work. But should we use more workers from abroad to fill vacancies?
The Brexit decision was a choice not to fill those vacancies with unlimited migration, which I think is the right choice.
So let's start with the story that has rather dominated the weekend's news cycles. Here's the headline. Lineker to return to air this weekend after BBC deal reached. Yes, Gary Lineker will return to presenting duties this weekend after being taken off air on Saturday for breaching the corporation's editorial guidelines on impartiality. This follows his tweet, which criticised the language that was used by certain Conservative MPs in relation to small boat crossings. My question to open the show, starting with you, Danny Finkelstein, is has the BBC caved in to Gary Lineker?
Well, it has, but I don't think it had any choice. They clearly got themselves into a big fight with him they weren't going to win. If I put the question this way, would it be all right if the presenter of the Match of the Day decided they wanted to be very identified as a right-wing Conservative who was continually making political tweets? Would we want that? Well, you can see how difficult the question is. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. Match of the Day presenter falls right on the line. It was reasonable for the BBC to decide they didn't want him to be so political and to include him in their rules. Perfectly reasonable. But they could also have not done that. They've obviously got themselves, if they decided they were going to do it, they should have realised Gary Lineker wasn't going to accept that, and at some point the two of them should have parted company, not on some sharp issue. This way, I think basically the BBC has damaged itself. I think Gary Lineker has obviously managed to establish his opinion, but he has to reflect he's also damaged the organisation because he's humiliated them. You know, I don't think anyone's better off at the end of it.
Darren, what's your thought? Has the BBC caved in to Gary Lineker?
Well, factually, yes, they have. And I think basically they've just mishandled this whole dispute. It should never have come to this in the first place. And I think there are two underlying issues. One is about the policy that Gary was talking about, which I know we'll talk about later today. And the other issue was about the BBC's role for people talking about politics. And they're now going to review these guidelines. The interesting question is who's going to be running that and what's the outcome of that review going to be? Well,
you're absolutely right. There is going to be a review. And the agreement, according to Tim Davie, is that Gary Lineker will refrain from party political tweets until that review is over. But do you think the BBC has caved in?
So, I mean, as an economist, I'm super interested in the BBC as a public organisation because it's actually one of the most able and capable. It actually has metrics within around public value and social value, and it holds itself accountable to that. It isn't just there to inform, educate, and entertain, but they have this really interesting notion that they're not just there to fix market failures, but to actively shape, and they do it through thinking about individual value, so literally how good is a program, social value, pushing, you know, the fight against fake news, getting women footballers on TV and getting the public to actually back that, but also industry value. They've always shaped markets by actually being daring and risk-taking.
And has that been damaged by what's unfolded?
I'm worried that some of this political interference, which I think there's lots of evidence that that's happened, is actually making them more risk-averse.
Political interference from?
Well, we're going to go into a big debate now about this, but from the Tories. I mean, it's quite clear to me that what's currently happening is that our economy is sinking, and it's always much easier to blame immigrants. I'm sure we'll get there in a second. And so someone who actually takes that on, with a statement that is actually backed by many in society, and then has to withdraw that, or is asked to withdraw that, as opposed to actually the BBC maybe taking advantage of that moment and saying, hey, this is an incredibly important public debate, and let's harness that moment, as opposed to worrying about impartiality in such a static way.
We'll have that debate in just a few minutes' time. Has the BBC caved in to Gary Lineker?
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's a bit strange that I think they've overestimated his power. I think people would watch Match of the Day, whoever was presenting it. I don't think they clearly felt that they didn't want to lose him. That's their decision. I feel like his comments were fairly crass and historically illiterate, but I don't think that they're particularly relevant to what he has to say about football. Jo, if you were to tweet something like that, that would be a very different situation. But Gary's not a news presenter.
So you see the distinction between the two. Well, let's talk to...
I mean, he's constantly, right, making very the opposite spectrum.
We'll come on to...
And these are balanced things, aren't they? You could say Lord Sugar was the same as the presenter of Match Today. I probably wouldn't quite, but the BBC...
But why has he never been silenced? Why has he never been,
No, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question, because the BBC treats him as if he was a star in a programme rather than a presenter. That's why they said it was a grey area, and I think they obviously decided clearly that Gary Lineker fell one side of the grey area. They ruled that. He disagreed and defied them, and they managed to get themselves in a situation where in the confrontation they lost, which has damaged the organisation.
All right, well, let's talk to Tom Hunt, Conservative MP. Tom, you warned earlier today that the BBC shouldn't fold. What do you make of the agreement?
I think I need to see a lot more information about what actually comes out of this review into social media use. I've got some concerns that it won't come up with the kind of outcome that I think is appropriate, but I think we'll have to see when that review's done. But, I do think he should have issued an apology. I mean, this wasn't just about him sort of mildly being critical of government immigration policy. I think that some of the comments he made, particularly in relation to 1930s Germany, I think were deeply inappropriate. And I think the fact that he showed no contrition at all after that, no reflection, I thought was totally wrong. I get the point about how he's not a news presenter, but I think he pretty much is the most highly paid BBC employee there is. He's widely perceived as being a BBC employee. So clearly, when he makes comments like that, it will have an impact on the way many people perceive the BBC. And there's a growing number of people in this country who are questioning the licence fee, and I think this whole sorry episode will only increase the number who are seriously questioning whether the licence fee is fit for purpose and whether it needs to be looked at.
All right, well, look, there's a lot to unfold, but first of all, let's hear from the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, because he's been talking about what's been agreed with Gary Lineker, including that review. Let's take a listen.
What we've agreed, and I've spent time talking to Gary, and we've had lots of discussion, is that between now and when the review reports, Gary will abide by the editorial guidelines, and that's where we are. I think it was a very big moment in terms of us saying we have to take stock here, we have to take action. We did take action, which we thought was proportionate, and as the BBC, we believe we did the right thing. I think I did the right thing. Having said that, I think you have to look at the balance here and act fairly.
What's your reaction to what you've just heard there, Tom?
Well, I'm pleased that in the short term he will not be making comments in any way similar to the comments that he made last week on social media. I hope that review, when it's concluded, will make it certain that won't happen again. But of course, I do still think that an apology would have been is needed.
Yeah,
but that's my personal view, which I'm entitled to.
It is your personal view. Talking of personal views, that's what Gary Lineker, of course, said he was
I'm not a BBC employee. I'm not a BBC employee.
That's absolutely clear. You're a Conservative MP. But in that sense, in terms of whether or not Gary Lineker has, or rather the BBC has caved into Gary Lineker, to some extent, people might think that Conservative MPs like you were trying to put political pressure on the BBC in the other direction and hoping that the BBC would cave in to your demands.
My view was to... I've long had strong views on the BBC and impartiality. That was on record before this incident. I was appalled by Gary Lineker's tweet last week.
But why? Why were you so appalled? Why were you so exercised about what a sports presenter says in a tweet talking about the language being used by Suella Braverman?
Because a large number of my constituents are forced to pay his salary. We are forced to pay his salary he needs to abide by. He's a highly paid BBC employee. So, of course, for him to make, 50% of people, according to a poll I saw, agree with the immigration policy in question, and for him to say that there's sort of undertones of 1930s Germany in connection with the policy and some of the language used is clearly deeply inappropriate. And he's unable to apologise, refuses to apologise.
All right.
But look, I hope... That's a good question. I mean, what if he had just said he's following Trump's policies, which, would that have been okay? Well, because of course, that's another interpretation.
I think we're focusing on the wrong thing because we're focusing on the content of the... I don't think he should apologise, but we're focusing on the content of the tweet, whereas what we should be focusing on is the principle, which is whether the presenter of Match of the Day, that particular job, should or shouldn't fall inside the BBC's social media guidelines. The moment you pose it like that, you realise that you can make two choices. You can perfectly well justify him being in it and not being it. If the head of Match of the Day decided to start signing petitions, make a big political fuss, you can immediately see why that is a problem. So I understand why the BBC includes him in their
All right,
guidelines.
but Darren, in response to what you just heard from Tom Hunt, that it's deeply inappropriate for a Match of the Day presenter like Gary Lineker to talk about or compare the policies, immigration policy or the language around it with 1930s Germany.
Well, actually, what I heard Tom Hunt say maybe 3 or 4 times was arguing for the licence fee to be scrapped. And I think that's really interesting because it shows that there are a whole group of Conservative politicians who actually don't want the BBC to exist, and they confuse impartiality with independence.
That's not what I
don't want to end... No, you said you talked about the licence fee on 3 or 4 occasions,
I didn't
Tom.
say the BBC shouldn't exist. I never said that.
No, but you
That's
said the licence fee shouldn't be paid, which would fundamentally undermine the BBC. I don't want to end up in a world where we have Fox News and CNN arguing it out based on ideological views. I like the independence of the BBC.
Defend the impartiality of the BBC, then.
Well, then don't interfere in the BBC, Tom.
Well, the reality is there are millions of people today, perhaps more so than last week, who have lost confidence in the BBC as a result of what's happening.
Why is it OK for you to interfere in the BBC?
And whether you like it or not, that is the case.
Darren, what evidence do you have that this is a result of interference in the BBC? I mean, you can see surely that without any interference, you could easily reach the logical view that you shouldn't allow the presenter of Match of the Day to express a view. Let's leave aside what the views are. You could, by the way, decide not to do that, but once you decided to do that, clearly Gary Lineker has made a perfectly reasonable decision. He wants social liberalism of different kinds to be part of his public profile, and that is... It's totally understandable for him, but understandable for the BBC not to want that.
You asked me what the evidence is of political interference. It's the 36 Conservative MPs that signed a letter. It's the appointment of the chairman of the BBC. There's quite a lot of evidence of political
There's certainly
interference
evidence, and by the way, you can see that I don't share this view. I certainly wouldn't have signed that letter, but there's certainly plenty of evidence that people feel very strongly about it. That's the case. But what was the origin of this decision? I think it was Tim Davies set a guideline about who would be inside and outside the social media guideline, and decided Gary Lineker would be inside it. And that may have been a mistake, but that's what we're really dealing with. And all this other stuff is just people making their own political points, including...
Well, it may be, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. But first of all, Tom, I'll come back... Sorry, go on, Tom. You say, and then I must get to Alison.
At the end of the day, people will come to their own conclusions about what's happened over the last week, and they're entitled to do that. But what a lot of people can see is the BBC cutting valuable local radio content, which a lot of my constituents get a lot from, and they can see people on huge wages, eye-watering wages, who feel as though, paid for by a taxpayer, who feel like they can act with impunity when it comes to some of the comments they make. And I'm saying this not just moderately intervening in a political debate, but making deeply offensive comments that are essentially branding almost half the country, according to one poll last week, as being in somewhat sympathetic towards fascist rhetoric.
All right.
And it's completely inappropriate.
Mariana?
Well, I just back what Darren has just said, that what we've heard is that there's an agenda out there about the BBC. Forget whether it's correct or incorrect. This Lineker tweet has been used to go after that agenda. And I think, Danny's correct that if we actually then talk about the content of the tweet, then let's not talk about the 1930s. What he, by the way, was talking about was not that it's similar to 1930s policy, but the narrative, the language.
But that in itself is deeply offensive.
Okay, but anyway, but obviously that's not even your point. Your point is that you are, I don't know if it's jealous about Lineker's salary or what it is, but you keep talking about his salary. That's a whole other conversation. It has nothing to do with this, point right now. What we're talking about is whether a presenter on a sports program is allowed to put out a tweet
which has to do with for by the taxpayer.
Yeah, but you keep coming back to that. So why don't you just think about that and have a debate about that somewhere else, but not use a tweet to kind of surf on that to go after what sounds like is, a long-standing agenda.
Alison?
But I do think the two things are related. This is essentially an employment dispute about whether he's breached the terms of a contract, about what he can and cannot tweet. And the reason why it's dominated the news cycle, while it's been blown so totally out of proportion, is, as Tom said, because his salary is paid for by the taxpayer. That's why people care, and he does extremely well out of it.
Taxpayer compared to what, though? I mean, look at the revenue that particular program brings in because of his star quality. You talked about stars, as though Lord Sugar is less of a star than Gary Lineker.
No, you can make the decision that all the people who work for the BBC...
But the star quality brings revenue to the BBC, so you can't just talk about someone's salary.
It's not unreasonable to argue that the BBC has a lot of sports presenters. Gary Lineker's only one of them. It's not unreasonable for the BBC not to want all the sports presenters on the BBC to be politically engaged in public controversy. And the content of it, right, or the fact that you may disagree or agree with Tom Hunt's view about the BBC or who the identity of the chairman is, all these are side issues. The central question is, do we want to allow sports presenters to have a political profile or not? Now, you can certainly argue that either way. I'm not dogmatic about it. I don't think it was unreasonable the decision the BBC reached.
All right,
and he has to abide by it.
But let's just talk briefly about the language, because actually former Chancellor George Osborne yesterday told Andrew Neil on Channel 4, personally, I think some of the language used on immigration by some Conservatives, not all, is not acceptable. Do you agree with him?
I do agree with that, yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think that Gary Lineker was incorrect using the 1930s. I think the immediate you step into that is stepping into a lot of ahistorical analogies, and it's very provocative. But I'm certainly very concerned about it, and frankly, the overstatements of the Home Secretary are more important than the overstatements of Gary Lineker. So I am concerned about that, and I think it undermines, our status as a welcoming country to use language of that kind.
Right. Well, Tom, are you sympathetic to that view? Because there will be people, just like George Osborne, and you've just heard Danny Finkelstein, perhaps referring to the sort of dehumanising language, which is what Gary Lineker was referring to, and that actually there are similarities with language that has been used, whether you find it offensive or not.
Well, people talk about the rhetoric and the rhetoric they've heard, but I'd like those people to come up with the examples of a piece of rhetoric that they've heard or something they've heard from the government.
Well, invasion is one.
Well, actually, I think tens of thousands of people, mainly young men, illegally entering our country every year. I mean, is that not? It sounds a bit like one to me.
Right, Darren?
I mean, look, this is because the CCHQ, the Tory head office, has been telling its MPs to use these lines because they're using it for political division.
I've been
because
saying
they
this
think,
for 3 years.
Well, you've been saying it wrong for 3 years, might I say so, Tom? But
view.
you've been saying Tory MPs are saying this because there's a political decision that this is in their electoral interest to rile up this issue. It's shameful.
Is it analogous, though, Darren, with the Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, or are those two completely separate issues? Conservative donor, questions about a conflict of interest over the loan that he's accused of arranging on behalf of Boris Johnson, who appointed him.
Well, there's a separate issue, but it brings into the same question the role of politics and interference at the BBC, as I've already mentioned. And Richard Sharp's appointment is not just subject to a select committee review, but other investigations. And of course, this whole thing is deeply unusual. It probably shouldn't have happened in the first place.
All right.
Gavin Davies was chairman of the BBC, obviously. I mean, there are big questions, by the way, about the Boris Johnson incident, no question about it. But Gavin, it is quite often. Chris Patton was chairman of the BBC. Marmaduke Hussey was chairman of the BBC. So it's quite common
They weren't doing deals with prime ministers.
No, that's a different matter. I agree with you. That is a different matter.
Yeah.
I think that is a different matter.
Let's have a look at this headline in terms of the bill that is coming back to the House of Commons this afternoon, the illegal immigration bill. Caroline Notes, Conservative MP, says, I'm horrified by migrant bill and will vote against it. Will you, Danny?
I certainly concede. I don't think I'll be voting against the second reading because the Lords doesn't do that anyway. But secondly, I think the principle of trying to do something about it is right, but I can imagine voting against it on several of the issues. I'm concerned about safe passage. I'm concerned about children and children detention. And I'm concerned, and this is a bit more central, about the issue of appeal. That's a bit more of a difficult question to work out. But there are certainly substantial questions I've got about the bill.
Oh, well, let's just show you the headline. The Observer, former Home Secretary Priti Patel, also has concerns about child refugees and whether or not they'll be detained or deported under small boats plan. Are you concerned about that, Tom? Should child refugees be deported and detained? Detained and deported, I should say.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that unaccompanied children or unaccompanied minors, they will be looked after by local authorities. So unaccompanied, they won't be detained. That isn't what's going to happen. When they reach 18, though, that obviously they're an adult at that stage, so it's different.
All right.
But in terms of families coming, I mean, the issue is, though, if we had a different policy for families as to, say, single men or whatever else. I mean, but the danger there would be that the people smugglers would actually specifically target those families, and they'd be more likely to go on these dangerous crossings as a result. So ultimately, though, I don't think that would be a wise thing to do.
Tom Hunt, thank you very much for joining us. You wanted to say
well,
something,
I was just going to say that, I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned is just the disaster that Brexit has been on this front. I'm not talking about the economy quite yet. So the Dublin 2020 system, which then, due to Brexit, we backed out of, has actually made this whole territory much more messy. And we should remember that the UK was actually the lead signatory on all these different conventions, right? So the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, the 1951 UN Convention of Refugees. And so for a country that has actually led on so many of the values, Nanny, that you just talked about, to be now scrambling and to be really governing in such a dysfunctional way this problem, which ultimately is about human rights, and there's laws, and we are disobeying, we are,
well, they're saying pushing the boundaries is how they put it, the government.
I think the current situation we have, where we have a sort of Hunger Games situation where it's wealthy, it's people who are wealthy and fit enough to make this journey who are gaining asylum. That's not fair and that's not compassionate. And doing nothing about this is an active choice, the moral consequences of which are people dying in the Channel. I'm not saying that there are not problems with this bill. I thought it was very disturbing that the Chancellor was unable to say yesterday on Laura Kuenssberg whether this would involve detaining children. And the situation we have at the moment with unaccompanied children who are already putting immense pressure on local authorities that are looking after them. They do not have the resources to do this. I think there are a lot of practical problems with this bill. But I do think that the status quo is not acceptable. And I think it may well be that the only way that you can break this link between coming here illegally and gaining asylum is to make it so that is not possible.
But even just the words gaining asylum, you have a right to asylum.
Yeah, but
and, this assumption that it's Hunger Games and all these fit people that are running over
that's
here.
That's fine, that's true.
Just the language that we're using is profoundly wrong.
But, sorry, I should have let you finish.
No, it's okay.
I apologise.
I'm done.
I apologise. 100 million people have that right, and that's what worries me. So I'm not saying I have the solution to this, but the more you study it, the more you realise how intractable it is. We've got a commitment now, in which we signed up to, and you're right, we were the leader on. I don't see how we deliver that commitment, and that's a big problem.
And what is your remedy? I mean, apart from criticising the government, which of course is your right, you're the opposition. But what is your plan? Is it just to leave it to the Conservatives and hope it's all gone away by the time of the next election?
Well, no, but the Conservatives are in government, so they're supposed to do something about it. This bill is not necessary. The government doesn't need new legislation. It tried to do this with a bill 9 months ago and it hasn't worked. What it needs to do is resource effectively the enforcement, the police, the border staff, the relationships with our colleagues in Europe to deal with these issues at root cause and to make sure there are safe and legal routes for people who have to climb asylum in a way that I think the British people would want them to do. Just passing legislation to create political opportunities is just a shameless way of handling this issue. If Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, was really deeply caring about this issue, he would announce resource allocation, a funding for a joint crime unit,
which
and
they
all the
have,
other
of course,
things
for
that
more
we've talked about in the Labour Party.
We're going to move on because Alice mentioned the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and of course it is the budget on Wednesday. And we'll have a special programme on Politics Live starting at 11:15, so please make sure you join us all the way through till 3 o'clock. It's been billed as the Back to Work budget. Let's have a look at this headline in The Sun. Jeremy Hunt will unveil Back to Work budget to help get over 50s clocking on again. And this is all about trying to tempt back people who've left the workforce in their 50s to fill over 1 million vacancies. Let's listen to what Jeremy Hunt, or rather, Philip Hammond, a former Chancellor, said in response to Jeremy Hunt's claim to get people back into work.
If I was the Chancellor and I was unconstrained, I would relax the immigration rules in a very specific and narrow way, in that I would issue a certain number of short-term work visas for people who would come here to do mainly lower-skilled work with no right to remain, no rights of settlement, come, stay 3 years, work and leave.
Does that sound sensible, Alice? As we heard Jeremy Hunt saying the Brexit decision was a choice not to fill those vacancies with unlimited migration, which he thinks is right, but Philip Hammond thinks he should. Yeah,
I mean, personally, I would certainly support migration to fill these vacancies. People who are struggling to recruit, the NHS, we know, has real problems. And I think immigration is culturally good for the country, and I think it's good for the economy too. Though I do accept that politically that might not be a possible thing to do. What I think is really worrying is the levels of economic activity that we're seeing, particularly among young men who have long-term mental health problems and who are not even seeking work. That is going to have lifelong devastating consequences for those people. That is a structural problem that we need to address to make better life chances for British people, at the same time as welcoming immigrants into our health service.
Should the immigration rules be relaxed?
Well, the Migration Advisory Committee is supposed to set out where there are parts of the economy where migrant labour can help, and that needs to be done more flexibly, yes. But as Alice was saying, we've got structural problems. Over 50s, about 500,000 have left, half of those because they're sick. That's not going to be easy to fix. The other half because they want to. Some of these measures might help them to come back. But we do have a deeper long-term structural problem in that 16 to 24-year-olds in active employment has been decreasing for many, many years. But we're an ageing population. This is something we're going to have to grapple with. And as Marianne has already mentioned, the lack of freedom of movement has meant that that's one piece of the puzzle where the flow of workers has changed, and we're going to have to deal with it.
Marianne?
Well, the labour shortages, again, that we currently have, and I don't want to say that Brexit is the cause of all problems, because it's not. We had structural problems, and you're very right to use that word, structural problems, for a long time. But what we need to be thinking about is labour broadly. First of all, the global share that labour has of global GDP is actually at the lowest it's ever been. The capital share is at one of the highest. And one of these questions is really about extraction. How do we get the profits that are being generated in the system to get reinvested back into the economy instead of extracted out, for example, in ways that companies like Centrica do with massive share buyback schemes, right? So looking at the budget, what you really want to be doing is looking at all the different levers we have to steer the economy, to be more inclusive, more sustainable. On the taxi ride over here, I drove by your taxis, drove by UCLH, University College Hospital. It's full of striking workers. Why are they striking? They were clapped during COVID. They were called essential workers. We haven't treated as essential the whole social infrastructure within which they work. We're not paying them the salaries that they should be earning. We are overworking them.
What should they be earning?
Sorry?
What should they be earning?
Well, there's very many different types of workers. So what do you mean? There's not one number.
I mean, you just said that there was an amount.
Well, let's talk about nurses. Well, let's talk about nurses,
was.
for example. They asked originally for a 19% pay rise. Junior doctors are asking for a 35% pay rise because they claim stagnant wages have meant that that's the equivalent of what they've lost over 10 or 12 years. Is that what we should be looking at?
Well, first of all, these things get negotiated by trade unions, right? So it's not us in a news show. So one of the issues is, what is the deal? You know, we talk about things like the Green Deal. What's the healthy deal? What's the COVID deal? What did we learn? So, for example, the vaccine rollout in this country was really successful because we had a decentralized network of GP practices within the NHS that delivered an incredible value to the country. We had then Deloitte, and I'm sure we'll come to the consultants in a minute, that were, charged to do test and trace. They actually massively failed. What did we learn? Are we now resourcing and making more innovative the NHS through that?
Well, let me put it another way.
No.
How do you
Are we giving Deloitte more contracts?
All
yes.
right. Well, how do you achieve a high wage economy then? Let's not discuss exactly right. You achieve it, but is it also about keeping migration down to whatever levels politicians might agree? Is that how you get a higher wage economy? No.
You want to make this country a really cool, dynamic, innovative hub of activity in different areas that then attracts talent. I'm not saying I'm the most talented, but I came to this country because it actually was a research and a science powerhouse. We are now slowly decaying that from the fact that we don't even have access to, for example, the Horizon funds in Europe. We have not actually been keeping our research funding and our science funding at pace compared to our competitors globally. So that's the science side.
Yeah,
but also you need to resource things like apprenticeships. We need to improve working conditions.
Yeah.
And we need to create hubs of activity like around digital services for the green economy. That doesn't just come out of thin air. You have to invest in that.
Sure, but was Jeremy Hunt right when he said that this country has made a choice? It made a choice with its decision on Brexit that we shouldn't fill the 1.5 million vacancies with labour, with workers from abroad?
I kind of think he was right, but I'm not sure he remains right. In other words, I think that is to ascribe to people a sort of great consistency of opinion on these issues that doesn't shift with circumstances. The truth is, when I listen to you, obviously all the things that you suggested were right. I didn't agree with you about the strikes, as I think I pointed out, but the rest of it was completely right. But I think that's probably true, and there's an effect on having large-scale immigration on probably lower paid wages. In other words, probably, if you allow a large amount of immigration, you're privileging us as consumers, but reducing wages at the margin, right? There's certainly both of those things are true. I incline towards Philip Hammond's view, but I think it needs to be controlled because people also feel a sense that they want control. So. I don't think there's any one of these things by itself we've said round the table.
But, I mean,
they're probably all true.
I mean, if we're talking about tech and wanting to have innovative, dynamic companies, I mean, that's a global industry which competes globally for talent. So I do think immigration is a really important part of the puzzle here. But also, I mean, you bring things back to
solar panels on our roofs.
I mean,
right? Do we have labour that's doing that right now? And
I'm agreeing with you, but I also think Brexit is one issue here. I think you're right that Brexit wasn't one thing. Immigration was a big part of it. But I think COVID is really playing a part here. I think the mental health impacts, the reason why so many people are economically inactive is long-term mental health conditions. This has been a huge problem in our society for a long time. Mental health has been a kind of Cinderella service in the NHS, and we were supposed to have parity of esteem. But I think the response to COVID, which clearly prioritised physical health over the mental impacts of lockdown, shows that this parity of esteem doesn't exist at all. And I think that's
well, you're nodding.
Where do mental health problems come from? I mean, obviously all sorts of different areas, but when we under-resource the social fabric of society, including in really specific things like youth centres in our communities, where young people don't have a place to go, and a lot of the crime that has been experienced even just in London, if you look at the knife crime epidemic, you can't just police your way out of that. You need to look at the social and economic determinants of all these inequities.
I mean, Darren, how would you, you're the chair of the Business Select Committee, so you're dealing with these sorts of issues on a weekly basis. How do you plug gaps in the workforce and taking on the issues that Alice has said about long-term sick, given Keir Starmer has committed to the Labour Party saying days of cheap labour are over?
So, look, we've been looking at this for many months on the Select Committee with our labour market inquiry, which we've just about finished. And it's a difficult problem. In a simple way, there are so many jobs that need doing in the UK, and there are so many people who are available to do those jobs.
Yes.
And some of those people have the right skills and some of those people don't. And parts of the puzzle can be about migration, they can be about pay, they can be about levelling up. But the key issue is that for too long, productivity in the private sector has been underperforming because of a lack of investment in skills and training over many, many years. That's resulted in a reduction in the level of tax coming into the Treasury to help resolve the pay disputes in the public sector. You need a whole of government approach to this that recognises it's not an easy fix with one budget. It's a long-term problem where, as a consequence of Brexit, which has accelerated these problems, you need a long-term strategy from government, as Keir Starmer calls them, missions in the economy.
Right. Is Jeremy Hunt, though, doing the right thing? He's going to announce a package to sort of tempt over 50s back into the workforce. I don't know what he'll do or announce, whether he'll relax any of the immigration rules to plug those gaps now. Is that the sort of strategy you want to see?
Well, I've not seen the detail, but it'll be one part of the answer, but it's not the only answer. And if the government really wants to get a grasp of this, it's going to have to show a much longer-term strategy that deals with the fundamental problems around work, pay and investment in training. Do you know, when you ask ministers who's responsible for in-work training and adult education, there's 5 of them, and they all point at each other when they say it's someone else's fault. Someone has to get a grip of this in government. If it's a priority, the government will say so.
And does it need to be a priority?
Clearly, industrial growth needs to be a priority, absolutely it does. And clearly, lots of things that we've talked about can work. I'm just saying that doesn't necessarily mean we don't need to have immigration control, because I think we need to have both those things.
Mariam?
Well, just to pick up on the concept of missions, I actually wrote a book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. I've been talking to the Labour Party for some years about this. And what missions are is it's a way to have a goal, like reducing the digital divide to zero, having net zero cities, and so on, that actually require a lot of different sectors and businesses to work with government to achieve. So we need to really go beyond this ideology that it's either the state or it's a private sector, that intersectoral investment to actually achieve a goal. That could spur growth. But if in the meantime we have a private sector which has gotten used to just receiving kind of, handouts, subsidies, guarantees without any conditions attached, like Biden has just done with the CHIPS Act, where $350 billion or whatever it is to the semiconductor companies is conditional on not using it for share buybacks, greening your supply chains. Childcare, investing in working conditions or better working conditions.
Well,
and it's not about micromanaging them, but it is about getting a good negotiation organization of public and private working together with a fair deal on really difficult challenges.
It's interesting that you bring up the sort of tension between private, whether one is bad or good, private or public, because you deal with this in your latest book, and this is about management consultants. Just to give you the sort of backdrop to this week, though, first of all, I'll just show you strikes continue. Junior doctors, we've talked about, also civil servants to strike. This is on budget day. Around 133,000 members of the Civil Servants Union are striking over ongoing row on pay and conditions. Now, there has been a cloud, to some extent, hanging over the civil service for the last few years, with Boris Johnson's plan initially to cut 91,000 jobs. That has been dropped by Rishi Sunak, but there is still a drive to look at efficiency savings, which could mean large numbers of jobs at risk. Now, you look at this issue, Mariana, in your book. You've said that over-reliance on consultants wastes taxpayers' money and infantilises civil servants. But you've just said there needs to be a balance between the two.
Yeah, well, first of all, that word, infantilises the civil servants, was from one of your colleagues, Danny, Lord Agnew, who, on the back of the amount of money that this government was spending on both COVID and Brexit previous to that, just said, oh my God, what are we doing? Why aren't we actually investing within the civil service? Not instead of the private sector. We need public and private to work together, but if the public sector stops actually investing in its in-house capabilities, you inevitably get overly reliant on others to come in and advise you. On top of that,
and what's wrong with that?
Well, if those who then are asked to come in, let's just take the Deloitte case with test and trace, actually don't really have capability and capacity in that area, but are being brought in just because there's this kind of aura of efficiency, of dynamism in the McKinseys, the KPMGs, the PwCs, because in the meantime we have dismantled government, including, by the way, coming back to the BBC discussion, by kind of, making it more and more risk averse.
Well, what do you say?
Well, I don't doubt that a lot of money is wasted on consultants. But, I mean, you use the test and trace example, but consultants were involved in the vaccine rollout as well, which was very successful. And I suppose I would...
That was mainly done through the NHS.
Well, Kate Bingham, of course, led it, didn't she?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would stick up
vaccine.
for management consultants to this extent. I'm sure you're right that there's a vast amount of parasitism. But I do think that too often British people have a kind of a winging it, a blagger attitude. And actually, anyone who's had a bad boss knows that management is a technique. It is a skill that you can learn. And that I think to that extent, management consultants can provide useful insight. And I suppose my last thing I would say, that the best boss I ever had was an ex-management consultant. So I do think they have useful skills.
But sorry, can I just say one thing? It's not about not having smart management. The problem is that when you start to defund your own ability to manage internal processes, right? So the private sector needs to manage well. They go to business schools. We have these great courses like strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. The civil service is basically trained to think that at best it can fix a market failure. So it's always in reactive mode. What we actually need is private and public that proactively work together, as we said before. But if you don't invest in those capabilities, you have a problem.
So you're the expert, and I haven't read your book, and I'm looking forward to doing that. It sounds very, very interesting. I just wanted to ask you a question, because one of the things that I find management consultancy useful for is that it's kind of independent. We're often calling for independent thought, and it's standing outside whatever body might be, and you then do challenge, I suppose, groupthink, internal groupthink. Have you found that to be of value? Maybe you think, yes, it's a value, but we still use too much of it.
I think that we are assuming that there's this independent body that's coming in to provide kind of real knowledge and expertise in an area, right? So don't forget that a lot of people consult. Doctors consult to other hospitals, like an oncologist who's an expert might come in. Nurses consult, head teachers consult, academics consult. We're looking at an industry where the fundamental business model is actually problematic because, first of all, there's a big conflict of interest. There's no incentive to make your client, in this case, a government, for example, to be more capable and independent, because then you're not going to get another contract. The other thing is the lack of transparency. In South Africa, for example, Bain was accused because it was on both sides of the street. We often have, but also McKinsey has been accused of this, for example, consulting with Eskom, a state-owned enterprise, at the same time that you're consulting with the Treasury, which in theory is supposed to be regulating Eskom.
But hang on, Mariana, you say that there haven't been attempts. Ironically, it was Dominic Cummings, actually, the former Chief of Staff for Boris Johnson, who set up a unit inside Number 10 called Crown Consultancy that was intended to do what you are suggesting, which is actually look at the value and reduce the number of management consultants. But in fact, what happened recently in the Financial Times, UK government scraps in-house consultancies as departments prefer Big Four. In the end, Dominic Cummings tried to do the sort of thing that Mariana was talking about and try and train in-house and reduce the cost, and it didn't seem to work.
No, it didn't. And a key issue for me, as the chair of a select committee in Parliament, is accountability for the outcomes of the advice that's given.
Right.
Officials and ministers are accountable to Parliament for the use of public funds and their decision making. When they use these external agencies, often they can't tell us who's advising them or on what basis. I tabled a parliamentary question, I think maybe 2 months ago, just asking the government, how much have you spent on McKinsey in the last 6 months?
Management consultancy.
Management consultancy, there are others available. The government has not answered my question. And I can't call McKinsey in and say, what advice did you give and on what basis did you come to that conclusion? And is that good for taxpayers or not?
Right, but I mean, the point is outcomes probably for most voters is what's important, isn't it? As well as the cost and the value. I mean, what about Danny's point about challenging groupthink? Isn't that the idea? Wasn't that the point of having outside agencies?
Can I add a question to that? Which is, why do business... this is a genuine question as opposed to a challenge. Why do businesses use consultants then?
We also tackle that.
So in other words... the government's using consultants, but businesses obviously find them very valuable. Why do you think that's also a mistake?
Well, so first of all, the actual amount that's being spent, just to go to Darren's question, this is close to a $1 trillion industry, and in the UK, since Lord Agnew made this accusation that by using all these consultants, we're infantilizing Whitehall, the money has actually gone up by 12%.
Do you agree with that, infantilising the civil service?
I was going to get to your question.
I'm going to. I'll come to it back in a minute.
Well, I suppose when people get the consultants in, they're saying the civil servants can't do the job. And so I suppose that's infantilising them. Look, there are other...
Learning by doing. If you're not doing, you're not learning.
And how do you then progress in your career? But look, there are other models here. In America, they've got a great Office of Science and Technology, which works in the White House, where they bring external people in on a more flexible basis to work in partnership with civil servants. I mean, why can't we have models like that as opposed to giving over enormous amounts of money to consultants that then can't be held to account?
Alice?
Well, it may well be, you be the expert on this, that actually paying consultant is a more efficient use of the taxpayers' money than training up a civil servant who has less expertise. It's probably the case in some cases and not in others.
I mean, in the book, we go through failure after failure after failure and how unaccountable, actually, the consultants are. Exactly. In Australia, they failed with the climate strategy. Are they getting climate contracts globally? Yes. And coming
are
to
they ever successful?
Danny,
do you have examples
just coming to your question in
yeah.
terms of the private sector, we also look at that. The subtitle of the book is How the Consulting Industry Has Infantilized Governments, Weakened Our Businesses, and Warped Our Economies. We actually think the title of the book, which is the big con, we've all been conned, including in some ways the consultants. Many young consultants are very disillusioned with this. The private sector often needs that rubber stamp of the Deloittes or the McKinseys to actually pass through some controversial decisions to the board. So one of the things that we actually argue is that the private sector should be owning up to the decisions instead of surfing on the consultants for, difficult decisions around downsizing, around share buybacks, but even the ESG and the climate kind of targets today.
I can see that argument, but might it be easier, make smooth the path to difficult decisions? Might we get fewer, less bold decisions if you didn't have that kind of external advice? So, as I say, I haven't read your book, and I'm sure you've covered all these things.
But the external advice on the side is one thing. What we look at is how it increasingly has gone to the centre of what governments do, and that's the problem.
What about independence? This idea that actually are governments trying to distance themselves from making important decisions by handing it over to consultants rather than making some of those decisions themselves?
Well, if they are, that's completely unacceptable. I mean, what's the point of being a Minister of the Crown if you're not accountable for making the decisions about implementing public policy? I mean, that would be an insane argument for them to make. I mean, the whole checks and balance that we have in place is that the public's money and the people they elect to make their decisions are accountable for the spending and the performance of their decisions.
No, I think that if you get into government, which does look quite likely, you might feel differently about this.
we have lots of these kind of arm's length bodies. The OBR, we have the pay review bodies, lots of supposedly independent decision-making bodies that have huge influence.
And I mean, minister after minister has sat here and actually said it's the pay review body that makes these decisions, and we're following the recommendations, whether it's true or not.
But the best way to attract top talent into government is actually to have missions, to make it an honour
I'm going to have just to say live coverage and analysis of the Chancellor's budget on Wednesday. Join me for a Politics Live special from 11:15 until 3 o'clock, and I'll have expertise from across the BBC to explain what it means for you and the nation's finances. But from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.